This is Stoneleigh Abbey in Warwickshire, historic home of the Leigh family. Jane Austen came here in 1806 for an unexpected 9-day visit with her wealthy relatives. She was so impressed, she found inspiration for 4 of her novels.
Jane Austen came here for 9 days in August of 1806. She was so inspired by the building and the grounds that she would listen to what people would say, and she looked at her surroundings, added them into stories that became novels that became worldwide sensations. One of them was Mansfield Park. In chapter 9 of Mansfield Park, she describes the travel of Mr. Rushworth to Sotherton Court. This travel that she mentions is literally the travel that Jane Austen did from Addlestrop to Stoneleigh. And also, the building itself is designed after this building. So you are currently standing in Sotherton Court. This room alone is in half a page, which I'll paraphrase down to a line, where she said, "The family chapel of Sotherton Court is rather bland. Unless you stand on the family gallery above, with the organ behind and the red crimson cushions draping over in front. Look towards the heavens and you'll see a definitive style of beauty." And you can kind of see what she's talking about. So welcome to the staircase hall. And first to mention is the staircase. A self-holding cantilevered staircase, which means it's literally holding itself up. A wonderful piece of craftsmanship by Francis Smith. It was built in 1725, and when the Leigh family came back from a grand tour, they expected to see what they asked for, a grand staircase. But the size of the room, you simply can't fit one in. So that's why they ended up building what we see today. So, the Leigh family didn't have much of an imagination for names. If it weren't Thomas, it was Edward. It's simple as that, really. So here's Thomas, whose father was Thomas, whose father was Thomas, whose father was Thomas. Now this Thomas, he was a huge landowner, but he was also our first baron. And how did he become a baron? King Charles I. Charles I, at the start of the English Civil War, was working his way up the country, gathering royalist support. He headed towards Nottingham for his main speech about the Battle of the Parliamentarians. After that meeting, he heads back down the country towards Oxfordshire, and he wants to showcase his power by entering the 3rd most powerful city in the country and the 2nd most powerful parliamentarian city, and that was Coventry. When the king got to the gates of the city of Coventry, they closed the gates and said, "You're not entering." So the king wanted to negotiate, but needed someone's land to use. So Thomas stepped forward and said, "You can use my land. I am a royalist political supporter of yours." So the king used Thomas's land. The negotiations with Coventry lasted no more than 3 days. So Thomas did no more than entertain the king for 3 days, and the king eventually wrote a rather disparaging letter towards Coventry where he would warn that he would return. Of course, we all know he wouldn't. He gave Thomas a baronetcy to say thank you for all the help that you've given me and my men, and that's how Thomas became the first Baron Leigh as the king headed off. This left Thomas in a predicament. He's a royalist supporter by himself next to a very powerful parliamentarian city in Coventry, and then all about him. He was imprisoned, he was shunned, he was tortured, but he was not executed. His wife hands over £4,895, which in today's money is 7 million. This sets Thomas free, and now he needs to start selling land. Here he is pointing at a skull, which is known as the Vanitas skull. And that's his way of saying to his wife, "This would have been me if it wasn't for your love, because I am as mortal as you." Now this is a room where you would dance, you would play your music, you would act, and you would do seances. But we're not doing any of those. We're looking out of the window today. This is your best view of the original part of the building that Thomas Leigh built, and of course it was built and built upon. If you look straight ahead, you can see an arched window with a bench in front of it. That would have been the door to the treasury, the most important and safeguarded room of the whole monastery. Very similar to the door that you see on the basking in the sunshine on the left-hand side, very much a Normanesque style door. But if we were here during the time that the monks were here, we would not be able to see those 2 doors from where we stand. The reason being is they were inside, not outside, that we can see today. And on those you would see archways and then a roof on top of those archways, because we're looking at the cloisters here. Okay, the hallways. At the top in the red jacket, his name is Edward III Baron Leigh. He's the man who built the West Wing in 1726. The man who helped him build it is Francis Smith, the architect. But it's the man in the middle we're going to talk about, because this is the big story, and even today's families are still having that ripple effect. This is Edward V Baron Leigh. And here he is portrayed as a very pale 11-year-old boy in 1751. But he's already been Baron for 4 years, since the age of 7. His parents both died within a short period of time. He had an older sister, that was Mary Leigh. She was 13 when he was 7, but sadly it didn't go to the ladies, it went to the men or boy in this case. Now, being a 7-year-old boy looking after thousands of acres of land, it's just not going to work. So it's left to his uncle, who's his neighbour from Combe Abbey, Lord Craven. He takes over the business details and sends both children to Combe Abbey. He eventually sends them both off to their separate educations. Mary Leigh went down to Kensington, London, and stayed there. She was a socialite, a businesswoman, it was perfect. Edward, he went from Winchester School to Oriel College in Oxford, where he matriculated and excelled at every subject. He was incredibly intelligent, as was his sister. He left the college at the age of 21, still today deemed as the youngest fellow to leave there. When he came home, he asked his uncle if he could go on a grand tour of Europe. His uncle said yes. But when you come home, you take over the business details for you are the Baron. He said fine. Now, before he left, he was told to do a stopgap will. And in this will, he said, if anything should happen to me while I'm away, my sister Mary will inherit the estate. Now, they normally go for 2 to 3 years, but he was back in 6 months. He was not the outward Edward that left, he was very inward. But he was morose, he was angered, he was unhappy. So they were trying to work out if to approach him or not. After a couple of years of this going through, they realise that they have to send letters to his sister, who is still in London. She hears these stories and she heads back to check on her brother. She realises straight away there's a problem and brings in doctors to look after him in 1774. And at this point, they start to work on him. And 5 doctors ended up looking after him, but 2 were paid £100 per visit. The 2 doctors were from Bedlam Lunatic Asylum in London, so it wouldn't have taken too much persuasion. Edward died in 1786 at the age of 44 with no wife or child, which means, via that stopgap will, his sister Mary inherits the estate. Edward V, Baron Leigh's final commissioned work, Jane Austen herself would have seen this.